Nebraska Prairie, January 1897. Snow lay 3 feet deep across the hollow, and the wind that came down off the Platte had been carrying ice for 9 straight days. In the soddies and frame houses scattered across that stretch of Saunders County, families were rationing flour by the spoonful and watching their children's cheeks hollow. The grasshoppers had come the summer before in clouds thick enough to darken the sun at noon, and the drought that followed had finished what the insects started. Whole fields stood empty by August. Whole root cellars sat empty by Christmas. But on a small claim east of the wagon road, an old Czech woman named Marenka Vesely was lifting a heavy oak trapdoor for the 7th time that morning, descending stone steps into the earth with a tin lantern, and bringing up enough food to feed 31 people. She moved slowly because her knees had been bad since the winter of '92, but she moved with the certainty of a woman who had counted every potato 3 times in October and knew exactly where each one rested. In the upper chamber she gathered cabbages still tight as a fist, their outer leaves only slightly papery. In the middle chamber she pulled carrots from a wooden bin, brushing damp sand from their shoulders, the orange of them so bright in the lantern light it looked unreal against the gray winter morning above. In the deepest chamber, the one her neighbors had called her Madness, 3 summers running she filled a basket with apples that smelled the way apples smell in October, not January. 26 neighbors and 5 members of her own household ate cabbage soup, sliced apples, and boiled potatoes that night, because Marenka had spent 3 summers building what every man in the township had laughed at, and what every man in the township was now too proud to mention while accepting bread from her hand. Her neighbors had called the project foolish. They had called it old country nonsense. They had called it the obsession of a widow with too much time and not enough sense to keep her labor for the work that mattered. A simple dirt hole in the side of a hill was good enough for any homesteader, they said. A few barrels and a sack of straw, that was a root cellar. What Marenka was building, with its 3 separate chambers cut to 3 different depths, with its walls lined in clean river sand, with its pale clay vent shafts running up to small wooden hoods on the surface, that was something a foolish woman did to fill her time after her husband was gone. They said it that summer of '93, and again in '94, and again in '95, and they kept saying it right up until the morning in late September of '96, when the first wagon rolled up to her door with a hungry family and a husband who could not look her in the eye. She had fed them all, through October when the snow came early, through November when the wind began to take the tops off the haystacks, through the cold snap in December that killed 2 milk cows in the township, through the brutal stretch in January when even the wood boxes ran low. 6 families besides her own, somewhere between 28 and 31 mouths depending on the week, had eaten from chambers Marenka had carved out of the cool Nebraska clay, 1 shovelful at a time over 3 summers. What had she understood about depth, humidity, sand, and the patient, slow breath of stored vegetables that her neighbors had dismissed as nothing more than the strangeness of an old woman from a country most of them could not have placed on a map? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We have more documented accounts worth remembering, and your shares help these old lessons reach the families who can still use them. Marenka had come to the Nebraska Prairie in 1878, a young woman of 31 with a husband named Tomas, 2 small daughters, and a wooden trunk that held a spinning wheel, a copper kettle, 3 handfuls of garden seeds wrapped in oiled papers, and a small leather notebook in which her own grandmother had written, in a careful Czech hand, instructions for everything from making sauerkraut to raising bees. The young couple had filed on a quarter section just east of where the wagon road crossed Wahoo Creek, and Thomas had broken the first sod in the spring of '79. He was a quiet, methodical man who had learned blacksmithing in Pisek before they emigrated, and he could fashion a serviceable plowshare from a broken rim if he had to. He died in October of 1892, kicked in the chest by a young horse he was trying to break, and Marenka, by then 45 years old, with 2 grown daughters married to farmers of their own, and a son named Jiri, still living at home, became a widow in the middle of a harvest she had to bring in alone. That first winter without Tomas was the winter she began to think hard about food. She had always been the one who managed the cellar, of course. That was women's work in any household she had ever known. But with Thomas alive, she had never had to think about it as a system, only as a series of tasks. He would dig and reinforce. She would store and tend. Now, going down the steep wooden ladder into the small dugout he had carved into the slope behind their soddy, when the girls were still in pigtails, she saw the cellar with new eyes, and she saw that it was not enough. It was barely big enough for the season they were in. It was too shallow at the top, where her cabbages froze if she put them too near the door, and it was too damp at the bottom, where her onions sprouted before March and her squash went soft with rot. The single small vent Thomas had cut at the back of the dugout was clogged with old leaves. The dirt walls sweated in the warm spells and crumbled in the dry ones. By the end of February, she had lost half her potatoes, 2/3 of her apples, and every cabbage she had not put up as kraut. She climbed out of that cellar one cold morning in early March of '93, sat down on the frozen ground beside the door, and made herself a promise that she would not enter another winter with food rotting beneath her feet. Jiri found her there an hour later, blue-lipped and stiff-fingered, scratching diagrams in the frost-hardened earth with a piece of kindling. He asked her what she was doing, and she told him she was building a proper cellar, the way her grandfather had built one in Bohemia, and that he was going to help her dig it as soon as the ground turned soft enough to take a spade. Marenka Vesely was 22 years old that spring, a tall, slow-moving young man who had inherited his father's careful hands and his mother's stubbornness in equal measure. He did not argue with her, which was wise of him because she had not asked. He stood there in the cold and looked at the lines she had scratched into the dirt, and what he saw was not one cellar but 3. 3 rooms connected by a short central passage. The first scratched shallow near the surface, the second deeper. The third, deepest of all, dug down nearly to the level where the old well in the south pasture began to draw its cold water. He asked her why 3 rooms instead of one larger room, and she told him a thing she would repeat many times over the next 3 summers to anyone who would listen, which was almost no one. She told him that food was not a single thing, that an apple wanted one cold, and a potato wanted another, and a cabbage wanted a third, and that putting them all together in a single dirt hole was like asking 3 different children to share a single bed and expecting them all to sleep through the night. Apples wanted it cool but not too cold, and they wanted dryness near them or they would rot at the stems. And worst of all, they exhaled a slow gas that bittered the carrots and softened the potatoes if they were stored too close. Cabbages wanted the most humidity of all, almost the wet of a creek bottom, or their leaves would papery up and the heads would split. Potatoes wanted darkness above all things, and a steady cold that did not creep down toward freezing. Onions wanted dry, and squash wanted dry, and beets and turnips and parsnips wanted to be packed in damp sand so they would not lose their water through their thin skins. One room could not give all these things to all these foods. 3 rooms, each tuned for what it held, could. Jiri scratched his head and asked where she had learned all this. She told him from her grandmother's notebook, and from her own 78 winters of women in her family before her, and from watching what worked in her own cellar and what did not, and from one long conversation she had once had with a German woman in Wilbur who had described to her in detail the cellars of her grandfather's brewery in the old country, where they kept beer at one temperature and cabbage at another and meat at a third, all in the same hill. Then she stood up, brushed the frost off her skirts, and told him to oil the picks and the long-handled spades, because as soon as the frost let go of the topsoil, they were going to start digging. The first summer's work began on the 11th of May, 1893. Marenka had chosen the site carefully over the preceding weeks, walking the slope behind the house at all hours of the day to study where the ground stayed, coolest in the afternoon sun, and where the snow lingered longest in the patches of late winter. She settled on a place about 40 paces north of the soddy, where the ground rose into a low natural ridge of clay over sandy subsoil, with a slight tilt toward the east that would let her run a drainage ditch out of the lowest chamber without having to pump or carry water. The ground there had no large stones in the first 3 feet. She had checked with a probing rod, and the clay was the gray-brown kind that held its shape when it was cut, and did not crumble like the looser brown soil down by the creek. She and Jerry began with the upper chamber, which she planned to make 10 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 7 feet from floor to ceiling at its highest point, set with its floor about 4 feet below the surface of the ridge. This was the chamber she meant for cabbages and apples, the foods that wanted cool but not cold, the foods that did best in the layer of earth where winter's frost reached down only briefly during the worst stretches, and where summer's heat could never quite penetrate. They cut the entrance into the east face of the slope, a doorway only wide enough for a person in a basket to pass through, and they framed it with squared cottonwood timbers Jerry had hewn over the winter. The doorway was set deep enough into the slope that 2 feet of earth would always lie above its lintel. That, Marenka explained to him, was for insulation, but also for protection from the prairie wind, which she did not trust an inch. It was the 3rd week of digging when the first neighbors began to ride by and notice. Karl Hrubeck, whose claim joined Marenka's on the south, was the first to stop. He was a heavy-set man of 50, with a gray streaked beard and a habit of speaking through his teeth, as if he were always on the verge of biting something. He pulled his wagon up at the bottom of the slope, climbed down, walked the rim of the excavation Marenka and Jerry were standing in, and asked them what, in the name of all the saints, they were doing. Marenka told him she was building a root cellar. Karl looked down at the hole, which was already 8 feet deep at one end, and showed every sign of going deeper, and he laughed. He laughed in the loud, helpful way of a man who believes he is doing his neighbors a favor by pointing out their foolishness before they wasted any more time. A root cellar, he said, was a hole in the side of a hill, 6 feet deep, lined with a few boards, with a door at the front. A root cellar took a man and his sons 3 days to dig if they worked hard, and then it served the family for 30 winters. What Marenka was building, he said, looked like she was preparing to bury a horse. She did not answer him. Jerry, watching his mother's face, did not answer either. They went on digging. By the time the upper chamber was finished, in the 2nd week of July, every farmer for 3 miles knew that the Vesely widow had taken to digging up her hillside, and most of them had ridden by at least once to gawk. Karl Hrubeck brought his brother-in-law Wenzel Pohl. Wenzel brought his neighbor Anton Kovar, the German who farmed the half-section north of the road. Anton brought his hired man, who told everyone at the saloon in Wahoo about the strange enterprise, and the saloon talk spread the news to families Marenka had never even met. Most of them came at least once. Most of them shook their heads at least once. A few, the kinder ones, offered help, which Marenka politely declined because she had her own way of doing things, and she did not want it altered by men who thought a single dirt hole was sufficient. The upper chamber, when she and Jerry finished it that July, was a thing of careful workmanship. The walls were not bare earth. Marenka had insisted on lining them with rough planks of cottonwood, set vertically against the dirt with a 1-inch gap behind each board, so that the wood did not draw moisture out of the soil and rot, and so that the air could move slowly between board and earth and balance the humidity. The ceiling she framed with stout joists of green oak Jerry had cut from a stand on the creek bottom, and over those joists she laid 2 layers of plank with a 6-inch space between them, packed full of clean dry straw, an insulation she had learned about from her grandmother's notebook, in which she said would do as much good against summer heat as it would against winter cold. The floor she left as packed earth, deliberately so. A dirt floor breathed moisture up into the chamber and kept the air from drying out the cabbages, and at the same time it absorbed any small spills or drips, so the room did not flood. In the back wall, low to the floor, she set a clay pipe she had bought from a German potter in Wilbur, an honest 12-inch length of fired clay 1.5 inches across, which she ran horizontally back into the earth for some 6 feet before turning it gently upward toward the surface. At the surface end, she fitted a small wooden hood that opened to the south but tilted slightly downward, so rain could not fall in but air could move out. This was the exhaust vent. The intake vent she set near the doorway, low to the ground on the outside, but rising inside the chamber to let cool air settle slowly to the floor before mixing with the chamber's air. Karl Grubeck, when he saw the vents, asked her why she did not just leave a window. She told him a window let too much air through too fast, and that the trick of cellar air was not to flush it constantly, but to move it gently, the way breath moves in a sleeping body, neither fast nor still, but always faintly stirring. He laughed at that too and rode away, and that night at the saloon he told the men that the Vesely widow had begun comparing her root cellar to a sleeping woman, and the men laughed harder, and a story began to grow up around Marenka that would follow her through the next 3 summers and well beyond. She finished the first chamber in mid-August of '93, just in time for the early apples. She moved 70 bushels of fruit into it, along with 30 heads of cabbage and a row of strung onions, hung from pegs in the doorframe, where the air was driest and the onions would cure properly. Then she banked the entrance with 2 feet of straw and a tarpaulin against the worst of the August heat, and she turned her attention to digging the second chamber. Jiri, who had been watching her work with growing respect, asked her if it might not be better to wait until next spring. She told him that next spring was for the 3rd chamber, and that they had until the first frost to finish the second, and that he should sharpen the picks because the layer of clay below 7 feet was harder than what they had cut through so far. The second summer was the summer the mockery turned a degree colder. By then everyone in the township had something to say about Marenka's hillside. The first chamber, with its wooden hood vents poking up out of the grass like little chimneys, had become a kind of landmark. Travelers passing on the wagon road would point it out and laugh among themselves, and the laughter had taken on a sharper edge than it had carried the first summer because now Marenka was clearly not going to stop. She was in fact doubling down. Jiri had broken the surface for the second chamber on the 11th of May, 1894, almost exactly a year after the first cut, and this hole was being dug deeper than the first. The plan, which Marenka was happy to explain to anyone who asked, but which she explained only once before leaving them to make of it what they would, was that the second chamber would be 8 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 7 feet from floor to ceiling, with its floor set 7 feet below the surface, 3 feet deeper than the first. This chamber was the one she meant for the root vegetables proper, the carrots and beets and parsnips and turnips, and the bulk of the potatoes. These were the foods that wanted the deepest cold short of freezing, and they wanted humidity near saturation, and they wanted to be packed into damp sand so their thin skins did not lose their water and shrivel. The second chamber, being deeper, would stay several degrees colder than the first throughout the year, and it would have a higher natural humidity because the deeper soil held more moisture, and its temperature would change more slowly with the seasons, because the bulk of earth above it was greater. All of this Marenka knew, not from any book of physics, but from her grandmother's notebook, and from a lifetime of paying attention to how the cool of an old well at a hot August noon was different from the cool of a dirt floor in the same farmhouse, and from listening to the German brewer's wife in Wilbur describe how her father had insisted that the cellar for fermenting must always be a different depth than the cellar for storing. The work in '94 was slower than the work in '93 because the soil at 7 feet was tougher. A dense gray clay shot through with strings of small stones, and because the heat that summer was uncommon. June came in hot and stayed hot, and July was worse, and there were days in late July when Marenka and Jiri could only work in the cool of dawn and again after sundown, because to swing a pick in that hole at noon was to ask for a heat seizure. Anton Kovar, the German who farmed the half-section to the north, rode by one such afternoon and sat on his horse for a long time looking down into the pit. He was a square-faced man of about Marenka's age, somewhat more thoughtful than the Czechs and Bohemians around him, and he was the only neighbor who had not yet laughed at her openly. He asked her what she expected to keep in this second hole. She told him. He nodded slowly and asked her how deep she planned to go. She told him 7 feet of finished floor depth, with a 5-foot vault of earth above the ceiling for insulation. Total of about 12 feet from grass to floor. He nodded again. He asked her about the vents. She showed him the clay pipes she had ordered for this chamber, 2 of them this time, one for intake and one for exhaust, both set so that the air movement would be slow and steady, and could be partially shut off in the deepest cold by sliding wooden plugs she had cut to fit. He listened carefully and asked her one more question, which was how she was going to keep the walls from sweating in the spring thaws. She had been waiting for someone to ask her that question for 13 months. She told him about the sand. The plan for the second chamber, and indeed for the third when she got to it, was that the inside walls would not be lined with wood at all. They would be packed with clean river sand, a layer 4 inches thick, held in place by a wooden lattice nailed to a frame of upright posts. The sand would do 3 things. It would absorb excess moisture in the wet seasons and release it in the dry, regulating the humidity better than any vent alone could manage. It would prevent the clay walls from crumbling or sweating directly into the chamber, because any moisture passing through the clay would meet the sand and stop. And it would give her a place to bury her root vegetables, because once the sand was in place, she could fill the wooden bins along the walls with the same clean sand. Layer carrot, layer sand, layer carrot, layer sand. And the carrots packed that way would keep their water and their crispness all the way to April, sometimes May, when they would be just beginning to sprout but still firm enough to eat. Anton listened to all this without interrupting. He was, Marenka would later realize, the first man among her neighbors to actually understand what she was doing. When she had finished, he said only that it was a great deal of sand, and asked where she meant to find it. She told him there was a long bend on Wahoo Creek about 3 miles south, where the water had laid down a clean white sandbar over a generation, and that she and Jiri were going to spend their evenings hauling barrels of it back up the road in the wagon for the rest of the summer. Anton nodded once more, told her he hoped she would have good luck with it, and rode away. He did not laugh, but he also did not return to ask further questions, and Marenka understood from this that even he, the most thoughtful of her neighbors, considered her undertaking somewhere between eccentric and absurd, and was simply too polite to say so. The hauling of the sand was its own small ordeal. 3 miles each way over a road that went bad in the rain, with a wagon that could only carry 6 barrels at a time, and a horse that was getting old. Marenka and Jiri made the trip twice a week from the 3rd week of August through the end of October, rising before dawn to load and arriving back at the cellar after dark, washing the sand bucket by bucket through a coarse sieve to remove twigs and small stones, then carrying it pail by pail down into the second chamber and packing it into the spaces behind the wooden lattice. By the time the first hard frost came in early November, they had laid down nearly 40 cubic yards of clean white sand around the walls and across half the floor of the second chamber, and Marenka had filled the new wooden bins with carrots, beets, parsnips, and turnips from the small fall garden she had planted specifically to test the chamber. The neighbors by then had stopped riding by to watch. The novelty of it had worn down to a steady, low-grade scorn. Karl Hrubeck told his wife at supper that the Vesely widow was hauling sand like a woman building a beach in Bohemia. Wenzel Pohl said at the saloon that the only thing that hole was going to feed was field mice. The school teacher in town, a young woman named Adela Kearney, repeated to her landlady the joke she had heard from a man on the street, which was that Marenka was digging her own grave but in 3 rooms instead of 1, because she always did things grandly. Marenka, when these stories drifted back to her, as such stories always do in a small community, Did not allow herself to be hurt by them. Her grandmother's notebook had a line near the front, written in a faded brown ink, which translated roughly as follows: "Let the foolish call you foolish. The winter does not care what they say." She kept that line in mind through the second summer and into the third, and on more than one cold morning when she was half buried in clay up to her hips. It was the only thing that kept her digging. The second chamber, when she opened it formally on the 5th of November, 1894, was a marvel that nobody saw because she did not invite anyone to see it. She and Jerry stood at the doorway with a single tin lantern and looked down the short central passage at the carved-out vault of cold gray air. The walls, behind their wooden lattices, glowed faintly white where the sand caught the lantern light. The floor was packed, earth swept clean. The bins along the long walls were already half full of root vegetables nested in damp sand. The two clay vent pipes hummed faintly with the slow draw of cool air. The air itself, when Marenka stepped inside, hit her like the inside of a deep limestone cave, cold and damp and faintly mineral. She stood there for a long moment with her son and breathed it in. And she understood that whatever the men in the saloon were saying about her, she had built something that would outlast their laughter. The third summer was the summer she nearly broke. 1895 came in dry. The spring rains failed almost entirely. The wheat went in late and came up thin. The corn, when she and Jerry planted it, had to be carried water by hand for the first 3 weeks because the topsoil was already cracking. Through all of it, she pressed forward with the third chamber, the deepest of the three, because she had decided in the previous winter that if she stopped now, she would have a half system that worked, but a whole one that did not, and she had been too far in for too long to settle for half. The third chamber was the most ambitious. She planned it to be 12 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 7 feet from floor to ceiling, with its floor set 10 feet below the surface, 6 feet deeper than the first chamber. This was the chamber she meant for apples, primarily, but also for the keeping of cured meats, hard cheeses, jars of preserves, a few crocks of sauerkraut, and the longest-keeping winter pears. It would be the coldest of the three. It would have the steadiest temperature. It would be reached by descending 8 stone steps from the central passage, and Marenka had decided that those steps would be set with cut limestone she would buy from a quarry 40 miles east, because earthen steps would not last, and wooden steps would rot. Jerry, when she told him the plan, sat down on the porch and asked her quietly if she had thought about how much that limestone was going to cost. She had. It was going to cost most of what she had set aside from the previous year's wheat, which was a sum of money she had been hoping to save toward Jerry's eventual marriage. She had decided it was worth it. The cellar, she told him, was for the family, including whatever wife and children he might one day bring into the family, and the limestone would last longer than any of them. He looked at her for a long time, and then he said, "All right," and that was the end of that conversation. The digging that summer was harder than anything Marenka or Jerry had done in their lives. The ground at 10 feet down was a clay so dense and damp it had to be cut with a sharpened spade in slabs the size of bricks, and each slab had to be hauled up the wooden ladder one at a time and dumped on the growing pile of spoil. They worked from the 2nd of May through the 3rd of August, 6 days a week, often 12 hours a day. Jerry lost weight he could not afford to lose. Marenka's hands cracked open at the knuckles and bled into her work gloves, and by July she had to wrap her wrists in strips of muslin every morning to keep them from giving out before noon. Twice she had to send Jerry to bed with what she suspected was heat exhaustion, and once she nearly sent herself. The neighbors came less often that summer because the drought kept everyone too busy with their own struggling fields. But the talk did not stop. It only changed direction. Where in 93 they had laughed because the project was eccentric, and in 94 because it was excessive, In '95, they were beginning to mutter that it was downright suspicious. Why was the Vesely widow spending so much of herself on something so foolish when half the township was scrambling to keep their crops alive? Was she touched in the head from grief over Thomas? Was she preparing for some calamity she imagined was coming? A few of the more superstitious women began to wonder out loud whether she had taken to communicating with the spirit of her dead grandmother, whose notebook she was known to consult, and whether perhaps that grandmother had told her things from beyond the grave that the rest of them ought to be listening to. These rumors troubled Marenka more than the laughter had. She did not believe in spirits speaking to the living, and she did not appreciate being thought of as a sort of half-mad seer. But she also did not have time to defend herself, because she was up to her elbows in clay every daylight hour, and her response to the rumors became simply to say nothing and keep digging. The stones for the steps arrived in mid-July, hauled by a freighter named Brennan, who took one look at the great pit she had dug and asked her if she was sure she wanted them set down there. She told him she was sure. He shook his head, unloaded them, charged her his price, and rode away. Jiri set the stones over the next 2 weeks, mortaring them with a lime mix Marenka prepared from a recipe that had been her father's. And when the last step was in place, she stood at the top of the central passage and looked down through the lantern light at 8 cut limestone steps descending into a vault of cool gray earth, and she felt for a moment that her dead husband Thomas was standing beside her, approving. She lined the third chamber's walls with sand the same way she had lined the second, but she made the sand layer 6 inches thick instead of 4, because at this depth the clay walls held more water, and she wanted a thicker buffer. She built her bins along the walls with their bottoms raised 4 inches off the floor so air could circulate underneath. She set in the third chamber not 2 clay vents but 3, because the volume of air was greater and the throughput needed to match. She added a small wooden door of her own design at the bottom of the steps, hung on iron hinges Jiri forged in the small smithy his father had left behind, and she fitted that door with a strip of felted wool around its edge so that when it shut snugly. Above the door, set into the lintel, she fixed a small cylinder of white cotton soaked in a saturated salt solution and a thin glass tube she had ordered from Omaha, the closest thing to a hygrometer she could afford, by which she could read at a glance whether the humidity in the chamber was holding where she wanted it. The third chamber finished on the 7th of September, 1895, 3 weeks before the apple harvest. Marenka stood at its threshold with Jiri beside her, and she made him a small speech that she had not planned. She told him that what they had built was not for them only, that if hard times ever came to the township, this cellar would feed more than just the Vesleys, that her grandmother had often said a full cellar was a kind of charity in disguise, because nobody knew when their neighbor's cellar might be empty. Jiri, who at 24 had grown into a quiet and observant man, looked at her and asked if she expected hard times. She said she did not expect them so much as she did not trust the Prairie to be kind. She had seen too many seasons go bad in 17 years on this claim, she told him, and she would rather be ready and wrong than caught short and right. That winter, the winter of 95 into 96, was the first winter the full system was operating, and it was the winter Marenka began to keep careful records in the back of her grandmother's notebook of what kept and what did not. She entered the apples on the 15th of October, 60 bushels of wine sap and Jonathan that Jiri had bought from an orchard near Lincoln. She entered the cabbages on the same day, 90 heads of late winter green from her own garden, hung from pegs by their roots in the upper chamber. She entered the potatoes a week later, 28 bushels of Burbank and early rose, packed in wooden crates lined with straw in the second chamber. She entered the carrots and beets and parsnips, layered in damp sand in the deeper bins. She entered the onions and garlic and squash, all of which went in the upper chamber where the air was driest. She entered the crocks of sauerkraut and pickled cucumbers and pickled beets in the third chamber, where the cold was steadiest. She entered the cured ham Jiri had smoked and the wheel of hard cheese her elder daughter had brought as a gift, both in the third chamber as well. She entered every jar of preserves she had put up that summer, peach and plum and choke cherry and elderberry, and these too went in the third chamber on the highest shelves, where the temperature was most stable. Through the winter she went down into the cellar every other day with her lantern, and she checked each chamber with the careful attention of a woman who suspected she was building a thing that would matter. The upper chamber held at a cool 52 degrees in November and dropped to 41 in deep January, exactly the range she wanted for the apples and cabbages. The second chamber held at 38 degrees through November and December and dipped to 35 at its coldest, exactly the range she wanted for the roots. The third chamber, the deep one, held at 36 degrees almost without varying through the entire winter, and the humidity gauge above its door never read below 90% or above 95. Nothing rotted, nothing froze. The carrots in their sand were as crisp in March as they had been in October. The cabbages in the upper chamber, when she cut them open in February, showed leaves still tight and green and only slightly papery at the outermost layer. The apples, kept in the deep coldness of the third chamber, were so fresh by April that her younger daughter, visiting from her own homestead 12 miles south, took a bite of one and asked Marenka where she had bought them so late in the season. When Marenka told her she had grown them herself the previous September and kept them in the cellar, the daughter looked at her mother in a new way for the first time in a long while, and she said carefully that perhaps the neighbors had been wrong about that hillside. Marenka did not answer. She had stopped expecting any answer from anyone but the cellar itself. The summer of 1896 began with hope and ended with ruin. The spring was wet, almost too wet, and every farmer in Saunders County thanked the rains and put their corn in early. By June, the fields were green in a way they had not been green in 3 years, and the talk at the saloon in Wahoo turned for a few weeks back to the prosperous days of the late 80s, before the drought cycles had set in. Karl Hrubeck told his wife that this would be the year he finally bought a new wagon. Wenzel Pohl spoke of adding a frame addition to his soddy. Anton Kovar quietly said nothing, because Anton was the kind of man who never counted his bushels until they were in his bins. But even he allowed that the corn looked very fine indeed. The grasshoppers came on the 14th of July. They had been a recurring scourge of the plains since the 70s, and the older settlers remembered the great clouds of 74 well enough that they had been watching for them all summer. But no one was prepared for what came that afternoon. The sky went dim around 2 o'clock, and a strange clattering hum filled the air. And within 20 minutes the insects were on the fields in numbers no living person in the township could remember. They came down on the corn first, because the corn was taller and easier to find, and they stripped it in less than 3 days. They ate the leaves down to the ribs. They ate the silks. They ate the green husks off the developing ears. They ate the wheat stubble. They ate the gardens. Every garden in the township, every one but Marenka's, which Marenka and Jiri had been covering with old sheets and burlap during the worst of the daylight feeding hours. A desperate measure that saved perhaps half her vegetables. They ate the vines and the leaves of the apple trees. They ate the leaves off the cottonwoods along the creek. By the 18th of July, when the cloud finally lifted and moved north, the township looked like it had been swept by fire without the burning. What followed was worse, in its slow way, than the locusts themselves. The weather, having given that one wet spring, turned its back on the prairie. From the 20th of July through the end of September, The township received a total of less than an inch of rain. The corn that had been replanted in some hopeful fields after the locusts withered before it could tassel. The pastures browned and curled, the creeks dropped. By September, every farmer in Saunders County who had counted on his harvest knew that he was going to come up short, and most of them knew they were going to come up so short that the winter ahead would be the hardest they had faced. Marenka, watching all this happen from her ridge, said nothing at first because she knew that nothing she could say would help. She and Jairi had brought in what little their own fields gave them, mostly wheat that had headed before the worst of the heat, and a small crop of beans they had planted late, and she had laid in her cellar with the same care she had laid it in the year before. The chambers were as full as they had ever been. She had not enlarged her plantings deliberately, because she had not known the year would go bad in this way, but she had planted enough for her family with a comfortable margin, as she had done every year, and that margin, in a year like this one, was about to mean something more than comfort. The first family came on the morning of the 28th of September. It was Karl Hrubeck, the same Karl who had laughed at her hardest in '93, who pulled his wagon up at the bottom of the slope just after sunrise. His wife Magdalena was beside him, their 3 small children in the wagon bed wrapped in quilts against the chill. Karl did not get out of the wagon at first. He sat there with the reins slack in his hands, looking at the wooden vent hoods poking up out of the grass, and he chewed his beard for a long time. Then he climbed down stiffly, walked up the slope to where Marenka was hanging laundry, and he said her name and stopped. She turned and looked at him, and she saw what was in his face, and she did not make him say it. She told him to come into the house and have coffee. He came. Magdalena and the children came after him. Marenka set them at the table and gave them what she had, and after the children had eaten and gone to play in the dooryard, she asked Karl what had happened. He told her his cellar was nearly empty. The locusts had taken his garden in 3 days. His potato crop, what had survived the dry summer, had gone to rot in the small earthen hole behind his soddy, because the late September rains, the few that had come, had flooded it. His apples had not borne at all that year. He had perhaps 2 weeks of food in his bins. He had 3 children and a wife and an old mother living with them, and he did not know what he was going to do. Marenka let him talk himself out. Then she told him plainly what he was going to do. She told him that he was going to take what she could spare from her cellar, and that he was going to bring his family through the winter, and that when spring came, they would all sit down and figure together how he was going to repay her in labor or in seed, or in the next year's harvest, whichever he could manage. She told him she expected nothing from him before spring, except that he keep his children warm and not be too proud to come back when his bins ran low. Karl did not answer her. He sat at her table and he wept quietly into his hands. And Magdalena, who was a strong woman who had not wept once during the locust days, wept too, and Marenka let them weep. When they were done, she took Karl down into the cellar and showed him what she had, and she gave him a sack of potatoes, a bundle of carrots in damp sand, 2 cabbages, a string of onions, a small ham, and a jar of plum preserves for the children. He carried these to the wagon without speaking. He drove away without speaking, but before he turned out onto the wagon road, he looked back at the hillside and at Marenka standing in front of her soddy, with her hands folded in her apron, and he raised his hat to her, and the gesture was the closest thing to an apology she had ever received from a man in 17 years of widowhood. He was not the last. Wenzel Pohl came a week later, and his story was almost the same as Karl's. Anton Kovar, who came in the 2nd week of October, came not for himself but for the Schroeder family, 3 claims north, who had been hit hardest of anyone because they had only been on the land 2 years and had not yet built up any reserves, and Anton came as a kind of broker, asking on the Schroeder's behalf, because the Schroeders themselves were too proud and too stunned to come, and he asked Marenka if she could help them, and she said she could. The Krejcis, distant cousins of Thomas's, came at the end of October when their potato bin gave out earlier than they had hoped. The Bartos family, 6 children and the parents, came in the first week of November after the early snow. By mid-November, 6 families besides her own were depending in part or in whole on Marenka's cellar, somewhere between 28 and 31 mouths according to the week, and the careful inventory she had taken in October showed her that if she rationed cleanly and refused no one essential food, she could just barely make it last to the early garden of next May. She set the system up like a small commissary. Each family would come to her on a fixed day of the week, in the early morning, with a clean basket and a list of what they most needed. She would give them what she could spare, never less than enough but never more than necessary, and she would write in her grandmother's notebook the name of the family, the date, and the items distributed. She would not allow any family to feel that they were begging. She told each of them at their first visit that she was not giving them anything. She was lending them what God had given her, and they would settle the account when the prairie grew kind again. This formulation made it possible for the proud men, of whom there were several, to take what they needed without breaking. It made it possible for the proud women, of whom there were more, to feed their children without weeping at her door. The cellar held. Through October, through November, through the cold snap in early December that froze the creek solid for 2 weeks, through the storm in the second week of January that drifted snow up to the eaves of the soddy and trapped Marenka inside for 4 days, the cellar held. The upper chamber gave forth its cabbages and apples and onions in steady supply. The second chamber gave its potatoes and carrots and beets. The carrots as crisp in February as if they had been pulled from the garden the previous afternoon. The third chamber gave its preserves, its cured meats, its hard cheese, its sauerkraut, its pickled vegetables, all of these things which had been considered luxuries in many of the visiting households, but which became, in the lean weeks of late winter, the difference between a family eating well enough to keep their strength and a family eating just well enough to survive. She watched her stores carefully, and she made adjustments as the weeks passed. When she saw that the Bartos children were thinning faster than they should, she began including a small jar of preserves in their weekly basket without asking, and she did not write it in the notebook. When she noticed that Karl Hrubeck's old mother had grown a cough that would not heal, she began including in the Hrubeck basket a small stoneware pot of broth made from the bones of her last cured ham, simmered with onions and sage, the recipe her grandmother had specified for the breaking up of winter chest sickness. When the Schroeder family's youngest child fell ill in February, with what the township doctor said was a low fever of unknown origin, Marenka sent Jiri with a basket of apples and a request that the child be allowed to eat as many as she wanted, because her grandmother's notebook had a line that read, "In winter sickness, the apple is the most useful of all fruits, for it brings the spring into the room." The neighbors who came to her changed in their bearing as the winter went on. Karl, who had been the first and the most ashamed, became gradually her steadiest helper. He began arriving an hour early on his collection days and splitting wood for her stove without being asked. Wenzel began bringing her small gifts when he came: a smoked fish his brother had caught through the ice, a packet of tea his wife had been hoarding, a wooden spoon he had carved during his idle evenings. The Bartos children, all 6 of them, started calling her Babika, which was the Czech word for grandmother, and the title spread slowly through the other households, until by February, even Anton Kovar, whose own German word for grandmother was different, was using the Czech version when he spoke of her. The talk in the saloon, what little of it was happening that winter, had changed too. Where in the years before men had laughed about the Vesely widow's hillside, now they spoke of her in a different tone, the tone men use for a phenomenon they do not entirely understand but have come to respect. Some of them, the more thoughtful ones, began to ask her in the late winter how she had built it. They came to her in twos and threes, hat in hand, and they asked questions that would have astonished her 3 years earlier, questions about the depth of each chamber and the proper thickness of sand and the placement of the clay vents, and the angle of the wooden hoods. She answered every question. She let them descend the stone steps into the third chamber and feel the cold, steady air on their faces. She let them touch the sand-buried carrots in the second chamber and see for themselves that the roots came out of the sand, as fresh as if they had been pulled an hour earlier from the garden. She showed them the small hygrometer above the lower door, the wooden plugs for the vents, the lattice work behind the sand walls, the raised bottoms on the bins that allowed air to circulate underneath. She told them everything she knew, and she made them swear nothing in return, because the knowledge was not hers to hoard. Anton Kovar came one night in March alone, and asked her if he could borrow her grandmother's notebook for the evening. He spoke only a little Czech, but he had a daughter in the German school in Wilbur who could translate for him. Marenka considered the request for a long moment. The notebook was the most valuable object she owned, and she had never let it leave her house. But she trusted Anton, and she gave it to him with the only condition that he return it within 3 days. He brought it back on the second morning, having had his daughter copy out every relevant section in German, and he handed it to Marenka with both hands and a small bow that he must have learned in the old country. He told her, in his careful English, that what was in the book was not just a cellar. It was a way of thinking about food and time and the patience of the earth that he had not understood before. He told her that he meant to build his own cellar that summer by her design, and that he hoped he might consult her if he ran into difficulties. She told him he might. The winter ended in the way winters end on the prairie, slowly and then all at once. The wind shifted in the third week of March, and the snow began to soften, and by the first week of April the creeks were running again with brown spring water, and the first wild plums were beginning to bud. Marenka took her last full inventory of the cellar on the 11th of April, 1897, and she found that she had distributed, over the previous 6.5 months, somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 bushels of food across 6 families, and her own, that she had distributed it without any household losing a single member to starvation or to winter sickness, that she still had enough left in her chambers to carry her own family through to the early lettuces of May without further pressure, and that she had done all this with food grown on a single quarter section of Nebraska prairie and stored in a system she had carved out of the hillside, one shovelful at a time, over 3 summers of being mocked. She wrote one more entry in the back of her grandmother's notebook on that April morning in her own careful Czech hand, and the entry translated roughly as follows: "The cellar held. The neighbors lived. The grandmother was right. The summer of '97 was the summer the township began to change. Anton Kovar broke the ground for his own 3-chamber cellar on the 2nd of May, working from the German translation of the notebook, and he came to Marenka's place every Saturday afternoon to consult her on details. Karl Harubeck, who had made his peace with her in his own slow way over the preceding winter, broke ground for his cellar on the same day, working from sketches Marenka had drawn for him on the back of a flour sack. Wenzel Pohl began his in June. The Bartos family, who had no money for limestone or for clay vents, built a smaller version using only the principals, 2 chambers instead of 3, sand from the creek, bottom, vent pipes made of hollow cottonwood logs split and rejoined with tar. By the autumn of '97, half the homesteads within 5 miles of Marenka's claim had a cellar built or under construction along the lines she had taught. And by the autumn of '98, the simple dirt hole that had been the standard root cellar of the township for 20 years was on its way to becoming a relic. The wider community took notice. A correspondent for the Wahoo Wasp, the small county newspaper, came out to Marenka's place in the summer of '98 and wrote a long article on what he called the Czech method of cold storage, and the article was reprinted in 3 other papers in the eastern part of the state. An agricultural extension agent from the state college in Lincoln rode out to see the cellar in the summer of '99, took detailed notes, and incorporated several of Marenka's design principles into a pamphlet on farm food storage that was distributed to homesteaders across the Central Plains in the early years of the new century. The principles, by then, were no longer hers alone. They had become part of the shared practical knowledge of the region, and they would shape the way farm families on the Nebraska Prairie stored their food for the next 40 years, until the spread of rural electrification and home refrigeration changed the calculation. Marenka herself lived another 17 years on the claim. She watched Jiri marry a Czech girl from a family in Wilbur and bring her home to the soddy. She watched her first grandchild be born in the front room of that soddy and grow into a serious-faced boy who at the age of 6 was already helping his father in the garden. She continued to keep her cellar in working order through every one of those 17 years, and she continued to take her grandmother's notebook down from the shelf every autumn to consult its pages, and she added her own entries to it in the back, in a hand that grew shakier as the years went on. She died in the spring of 1914 at the age of 67, of a quiet failing of the heart, and she was buried beside Thomas in the small Czech cemetery at the edge of the township. The cellar she had built remained in service for another 32 years. Jiri and his wife used it through their own raising of children. Their eldest son used it after them into the years of the Second World War. It was finally retired, not because it had failed, but because the family by then had electricity and a kerosene refrigerator and a deep freeze locker rented at the cooperative in Wahoo, and the labor of climbing down those 8 limestone steps with a basket in each hand had begun to outweigh the convenience. They closed the wooden door at the bottom of the steps, banked the entrance with straw and tarpaulin one last time, and let the chambers go quiet. Decades later, in 1978, a grandson of Jiri's named Marenka Vesely, who had become a soil scientist at the university in Lincoln, came back to the old claim for a family reunion and decided to look at the cellar his great-grandmother had built. He took a thermometer and a hygrometer and a small notebook of his own, and he descended into the chambers for the first time in over 30 years. What he found, and what he later wrote about in a small monograph for the State Historical Society, was that all 3 chambers were still essentially intact. The wooden lattices in the second and third chambers had partly rotted away, and some of the sand had settled in places, and the roof of the first chamber sagged where the straw insulation had compressed over the decades. But the temperatures, when he measured them in midsummer, were still holding within 2 degrees of the ranges Marenka had designed for. The clay vents still drew gently. The deep chamber still held its humidity above 90%. The walls still stood. The system, he wrote, was a remarkable example of pre-industrial passive food storage engineering, drawing on Central European peasant traditions and adapted with intelligence and patience to the conditions of the Great Plains. and it deserved to be studied for what it could still teach. He dedicated the monograph to his great-grandmother, whom he had never met but whose handwriting he had come to know well from the surviving pages of the grandmother's notebook, which his family had preserved through 4 generations. The dedication, in Czech, was the line that Marenka had written on that April morning in 1897, when she had finished her last full inventory of the cellar after the failed harvest had passed. The cellar held. The neighbors lived. The grandmother was right. The legacy lived on, as such legacies do, in the lives of the families she had carried through that winter, and in the children of those families, and in the children of those children. The Hrubeck descendants, the Pole descendants, the Schroeder descendants, the Krazy descendants, the Bartos descendants, all of them stayed on the land or near to it, and most of them were the kind of people who, when asked at a family gathering why their family had survived the great failed harvest of 1896, would answer that an old Czech woman named Marenka Vesely had fed them, and that their grandfathers had been fools to laugh at her cellar when she was building it. The story passed down through the generations, polished by repetition, into something a little simpler than the truth, but never losing its central point, which was this: that a person who builds carefully against bad times that have not yet come will sometimes be mocked for it, and that the mockery does not matter, because the bad times come whether the neighbors believe in them or not, and when they come, the careful builder is the one who feeds the rest. On the Nebraska prairie, where a year of grasshoppers and drought had emptied every bin in the township, it was not the strongest farmer or the wealthiest landowner who carried 6 families and her own through the winter to spring. It was a 60-year-old widow with bad knees, a son who had learned to trust his mother's stubbornness, and 3 carefully built chambers cut into a low ridge of clay over sandy subsoil, lined with sand and ventilated with clay pipes, holding food at 3 different temperatures and 3 different humidities, exactly as her grandmother's notebook had described. She had taken 3 summers to build it. She had been called foolish for every one of those summers, and when the failed harvest finally came, as she had quietly suspected for years that it might, the cellar held, and the neighbors lived, and the grandmother, sleeping in her grave on a hillside in Bohemia, was right. If this story moved you, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. We work hard to bring you documented accounts of practical wisdom from the people who came before us, the ones who built carefully against hard times and passed their methods down to anyone willing to listen. Drop a comment with the name of the city or town where you are watching from, because we love seeing where these stories travel. And tell us in the comments whether your own grandmother or great-grandmother kept a root cellar, or any other system of careful preparation that carried your family through difficult years. The old methods are not lost, only quiet, and every story shared brings them a little closer to being remembered. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.